Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Cade Richards, and I'm one of the campus ministers here at the Lines for Christ, and I want to welcome you to the second week of Midweek Multiplied. I hope and pray that you are in a small group this week. And we love you, and I feel such a responsibility and an excitement to teach the text this morning, but I hope that you watched the first week's video because it's all going to tie together. And I talked a lot about our relationship with God and how we bear that image of God into the world. And so this week I want to start off and I want us to do a funtivity. I want us to do something like in your group, and maybe you can pause the video. But here's what I want you to do, and I'm making a point with this, so we're going somewhere. I want you guys to try to maybe pair off and describe the smell of coffee to your friends. So for bonus points, you can, if you work through that really quick, you can try and describe maybe the taste of honey to your friends. So you can pause the video, take a few seconds to do this, but I want you guys to start there. And so, yeah, I'm not really paused. All right, so the point that I'm trying to make with that kind of simple activity is there was this theologian named Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he has this kind of famous quote that says, "If we have trouble describing the aroma of coffee or the taste of honey, then how do we properly describe God?" So what I want to say this morning, and what I want us to think about as we read kind of this second account of creation, is, man, we are so limited by the words that we have. And so even whenever we talk about God being a rock, what does that mean? That's something that's so common to say, like God is a rock. But what does that mean? Does that mean that God is made of granite? Like, is he like a castle or something? Or are we alluding to the fact, trying to make this analogy that God is strong, that God is protective, kind of along those lines, but we still fall short. And so, man, it is so fun to look at the biblical text and kind of jump into the world of studying the Bible, because even with these revelation, this text, our description of God are not exhaustive, and there's some beauty in that. So we don't have an exhaustive description, but also that does not mean that the descriptions that we have are not significant. So we have this beautiful thing going on in the first couple chapters of the entire Bible where there's a couple different accounts of creation. So what I want us to go back to is the question that we asked the first week. Now, what is this saying about God? How does this story reveal God in a way maybe even that the first story didn't? How does this round out and give us a fuller, more robust picture of who God is? So I'm not going to fill all the blanks, and I keep saying that there's two accounts here, but if you're wondering why I'm saying that, is there's some simple things like the exact sequence of this account does not match up with the first account. We'll see that man being created before plants doesn't quite match up. So it's kind of this simple way that we can see, like, okay, maybe we have two stories going on here that are working together to show us who God is. And so what does this story add? And so I'm going to read our text this morning. It's Genesis 2:4, kind of the second half of verse 4, all the way through chapter 3, verse 24. When the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and no shrub of the field had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to work the ground, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. And the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden, and there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is Pishon, and it winds through the entire land of Havilah. where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon, and it winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Asher, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. He brought them to man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the air, and all the beasts of the field. But for Adam no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "Now this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." The man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the other wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say, 'You must not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.'" "You will surely not die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees in the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." So the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." To the woman he said, "I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." To Adam he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and dust you will return." Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Lord God said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So I'm going to talk a lot about this year the ancient Near East. So that has to do with like the area of Babylon and Egypt and the Holy Lands, and it just helps us understand kind kind of the context of that area, the historical context. So now we have a different perspective than the people that this text was originally written to. So in the ancient Near East, these people had a different understanding of the makeup of the world. So you see that really in this text, where it talks about the waters coming up from the earth to water the ground. So in this context, to these people, their understanding of the world was that there was earth and then there was sky, but the sky even held back the waters above. You'll see that in the biblical text a lot. So you had waters above and waters below, and there's even some like below the earth was Sheol. There's a very different understanding of the makeup of the world than we have today. And so I'm pointing that out just to say that in some ways, like last week, that these stories are a way that God could say, I created earth and I created you, in a way that these people would understand. So what if God had dropped this scientific manual on how he created the earth? It would have been completely out of context for its time. And even if he had done that, if he had dropped this scientific explanation of how the earth came to be, we still may not like it as humans, because our current science, our understanding of how the earth came to be, may be off from that. And so it still wouldn't sort of satisfy us if we had this textbook dropped into Genesis 1. And so I want to just point out the fact that I hope that this story, that this narrative that we're studying today, isn't something that's going to blow up your worldview. It's not something that that makes you jump into like questioning everything, that there's two accounts and it's not really scientific, but it's this story that's trying to tell us what God is like. It's sharing again some of the attributes of God. If we're going to go back to week one's analogy, I hope that you look for God in this text and what this text is saying about God. And so one of the things that I want to mention to you right off the bat is this really, really cool theme, motif, if you will, that we're going to see pop up over and over again throughout the Old Testament. And it is creation as God's good temple. And so I know that sounds really weird and your mind may be going several different places, but in the ancient world, temples were symbolic. They were these microcosms, basically these representations of heaven and earth meeting, a place where the gods and people interacted and the world was right. It was as it should be. And so I want you to put yourself in the perspective of someone in the ancient Near East. Whenever they see this God and he's dwelling with people and he's communing with people, he's talking with people, they're immediately going to think of a temple. And so this narrative is this amazing story where we see God's creation, and namely the garden, as God's temple, where things are as they should be, where God takes, like last week we talked about, he takes his image and places it in the temple, in the garden. And also, he is in the temple. It is a place where he dwells. And it's this really beautiful thing that we're going to see play out over and over again. But I have to start there, that creation is God's temple, a place where things are as they should be, that he is communing with man. And it's a place where he puts his image, where his image is bore to the rest of the world. So why does God place man in the garden? We see that right off the bat, that he places man in this garden. And pretty simply, the text answers that. If that's one of your questions, why is he doing this? He says it's to work and to care for the garden. And so if we have this concept that we are these divine ambassadors of God to the world, it's also paired with we are these servants and these workers in this creation and in this world. So we have this divine authority, but also we have this divine commission to work and to tend and to serve. And so this really ties in with kind of the temple theology, temple theme. And so if we are representatives of a king just as much, we are priests serving in God's temple. And so you, as strange as this may sound, you are an ambassador. We learned that last week, but you are also a priest. And I know that may be conjuring up a lot of ideas in your mind. You're like, I'm not a priest. But this gives such a richer and fuller understanding of what it means to be a follower of God, to be a follower of Jesus. And this is, going back to last week, this is not a meaningless life. And so we have this call, this commission to be workers, to tend the garden. And I want you guys to notice that this is not after things go sideways. This is not after the fall. That this is, people are working and tending the garden before things go sideways. And so it's not like work is this terrible thing that we are burdened with necessarily, but work is something that God deems good. And so if your view of a perfect world, or even if you want to go to heaven, if your view is just that we're going to be sitting around singing and eating grapes, then I would just contest that maybe your theology is a little bit off. That there is something good about working and tending in God's garden, in God's creation. And so I don't know how you think about work, but it may be something like you're thinking about digging ditches for $10 an hour, and you're like, there is no way that could be good. But think about the other ways in which we could work. Maybe working on an art project. Maybe it's you like carpentry and you want to build a coffee table on a Saturday. There's something so pleasurable and so rewarding about those experiences that it's something that you want to do. And so I want you to apply that line of thinking to what you do for 40 hours a week. And let me say a little bit more on that. If you spend 40 hours a week doing something that you think has no significance theologically with your relationship with God, if what you do for 40 hours a week is irreconcilable with like the rest of your worldview, it's a lot like being a renter and just throwing money down the tubes year after year and never owning anything. It's just a waste. But if you see yourself as a priest in God's temple, that you are to tend the earth, and that can take on so many different forms. But let me say this plainly. This is a way that you can show the good God by showing the goodness of His creation through that order, through beauty, through the goodness of relationships with other humans. I don't have to fill in all the blanks, but if you spend 40 hours of your week working in that capacity, showing the good creation that reveals the good God, man, that is such a way that you can live into this calling of being a priest in God's temple. That you can show God through what you do for 40 hours a week. Because the reality is most people won't be full-time ministers, priests. But man, you can show so much goodness. You can be such a great ambassador of God and display His qualities, His characteristics through your work. And so we're going to talk more about this later, but the beauty of this garden with these rivers, why is it talking about rivers and all this stuff? Man, the beauty of the garden is the garden was never meant to stay there. It was supposed to spill out. So he mentions these rivers because Eden is the source of the ancient Near East. Rivers brought life. They brought fertility to crops. And so what this text is saying is, man, the Garden of Eden, really God is the source of all this goodness that is then distributed throughout the world. And so we have to see ourselves in that story of beginning in the garden, but it was meant to spill out into the rest of the world. And really, we're going to talk more about recreation, but the Garden of Eden, God's view for the world is that Edenic kind of quality lifestyle would then cover the earth, that all of creation would be as it should be. It should be like in God's temple in the Garden of Eden. So what does it mean when God says it's not good for man to be alone? So down in the text we see that this is the only thing that God has said is not good in creation. And so that should tip us off that there's something going on that's significant here. And I think often we read this text, maybe if you've never read it before, you may initially kind of think that God is saying like it's not good because man's going to get lonely, and it has this emotional sense to the text of, man's going to get really lonely. But I want to make the argument that God is not necessarily addressing an emotional or even a psychological problem here, but he's addressing a creational one. And so man, as we have seen in the first chapter and then now in these chapters, man is commissioned. He has this huge task set before him to work and tend this garden, but then also he has to fill the earth and subdue it. He has to rule over the rest of the animate creation. And this task seems limitless. Like, how does someone accomplish something like this? And so God's solution is that he needs a helper, that man needs a helper. And I really do not think that this is a companion to just cure loneliness. God couldn't have remedied this situation with just a Netflix account. Like, hey, let's entertain this guy. He's going to get really lonely. But he needs a helper to stand alongside him as an equal, as an equal servant, a keeper, a filler, a subduer and ruler of the rest of creation. And man doesn't need company here. He needs help. He needs help. And so I want to tie this in to how we view dating and relationships, really. And this is a common thing is that man and woman should come together because they'd be really lonely if they don't. But this text is describing something altogether different. That man and woman need one another for their divine task in the world, to tend this garden, to tend creation, to fill the earth with God's image, and to rule over it with the image of God being shown through their rule. And so I just want to say, like, if you are searching out for a companion, a mate, a significant other right now, and all you're thinking about is yourself and how this is going to add like value to your life and going to cure your loneliness because you really would like to do life with someone else because you're just lonely, that is not the view for man and woman, for these two to come together. There's something so much more significant than that. Like, this sounds like kind of simple and straightforward, but man, there is way too much work to do. And I'm not saying that love and romance can't be there. That is such an amazing thing, a way that we see one another and we have these relationships and we get to see God through that. But at the same time, this loneliness is not the reason that the helper needed to be with Adam. That man and woman needed each other because they both have this divine task. And so there's also this kind of common image that, God created man and woman, and if they come together, looking back at last week's text, if they come together, that they kind of round each other out and they display the image of God. Male and female, he created them. In his image, he created them. So it's almost like man has certain attributes of God and woman has certain attributes of God. And when they come together in this relationship, then you fully see God. But I don't think, I'm not comfortable saying that, because if we're saying that man and woman come together, then they're saying that, we're saying that is God. And I don't think that's necessarily the case here. It's much like when we started off talking about God as a granite if he's a rock, if he's like good, like those things display God. They show characteristics of God, but I don't think they display the fullness of God. Just like human beings necessarily in our relationships can't display the fullness of God, but we show characteristics of God. It's still more multifaceted than that. And so I think this speaks to this question I keep coming back to: whose story are we in? If man and woman are just created for one another to cure loneliness, and that's really just a selfish perspective that we have, and it still becomes our story. But really we're seeing that this is God's story. And so I love this quote by Christopher J.H. Wright. He says this, I think it puts it really simply and beautifully. Humanity then is created in relationship, for relationship, and for a task that requires relational cooperation. So we have all of these relationships working together to fulfill God's given mission to the world that He gives to human beings. And so I want to skip down and look kind of as the rest of the text, when it's talking about the two becoming one flesh, he's saying like, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I think that again goes back to last week when you look at texts like that, I just don't see how that anyone that studies the Bible could support the idea of racism. That anyone that studies the Bible, if we are bone of bone, flesh of flesh, how can you support even sexism? We come from the same thing. We're both created by God, and we both have this incredible commission by God to fill the earth, to subdue it, to tend this garden. And so we need one another to fulfill this divine task. And I love this part in the text whenever it talks about the two shall become one flesh. And that's all the time, of course it's, people look at it like it's this reference to sexuality, the two becoming one flesh. And it does speak to that it does talk about sexuality. I think there's tones there. But at the same time, this is spiritual as well as physical. And I think it speaks to this last point. They were naked and they felt no shame. So all of that is kind of this concept working together that, yes, it is talking about relationships within a marriage, but also it's talking about relationships between human beings as they should be. So what I mean by that is there's something amazing about my relationship with my wife, and I'm not saying that our relationship is better than anyone else's. What I'm saying is that is a way in which I see God. It's a way that God shows Himself and reveals Himself to me through Rachel, that she sees all of me, all of my insecurities, all of my hurts and habits and hang-ups, and she still loves me. And that's what I think is going on here with this. They were naked with one another and felt no shame. So yes, am I saying that I would love for you to stand before your husband or wife completely naked and feel no shame? Absolutely. Absolutely. But there's also an emotional and spiritual component to that whenever you stand before your husband or your wife, and just honestly, if you'll hang with me here, whenever you stand, not physically naked, but emotionally and spiritually naked before other Christians, you should feel no shame, because that's the way that human relationships were intended to be. And so they say that the definition of real relationship is to be fully known and fully loved. You can't fully love someone if you don't know them, and if you know them and don't love them, that's something altogether different and really disappointing. And so whenever we come into right relationships with God, but even other human beings, we should be fully known and fully loved. We should be able to stand before someone completely vulnerable and feel absolutely no shame at all. This is real relationship. This is not hiding. This is complete vulnerability that is paired with complete love. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the next section in just a second. So this next section is where stuff goes sideways. And I wrote down some questions that I had whenever I was reading the text, and I just want to be honest with you guys about my questions with the text. So the questions that I wrote down were, why is this tree of life here? Why is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil there? What are we supposed to make of this serpent being there? Where did he come from, and why is he here in this good garden? I honestly can't fill in all the blanks for you guys. So I think this is a part of really this frustrating beauty that it is that God reveals himself in these narratives, in these stories. And we have to be honest about the fact that these are really hard questions. And we're going to have to really explore those. And we also have to take this revelation of God and his character in the form that it is in this narrative. But here's some things that I really do feel confidently saying about this text. So number one is this serpent is the first theologian. And I know that's strange to say, but there's an incredible quote by another theologian that I really respect named Walter Brueggemann. So here's what he says. This is not speech to God or with God, but about God. God has been objectified. The serpent is the first in the Bible to seem knowing and critical about God and to practice theology in the place of obedience. So whenever we see the serpent here, he's the first character, he's the first entity to say, is that really what God meant? And he's the first character to really question, what was God saying? He wasn't talking to God, but he was talking about God. So I think there's an important point here about the significance when we talk about God that we need to acknowledge that our words matter. And that's not to scare you to say you're not qualified to talk about God, but it's important that there's reverence placed on our words as we talk about God. And so, of course, when God tells them, not to eat of the fruit, so often I hate the fact that people, all they see in the Old Testament is these prohibitive laws. These laws that, it's like God doesn't want us to do this, God doesn't want to do this. But I just want to call attention to the fact that before this, God gives so much permission, and he also gives us this vocation and this calling, and to reduce this story down to just a prohibition of one thing is to really miss out on a lot of the key ways that God is revealing himself in this text. And so there comes this temptation. And to me, it seems like the temptation that the serpent is offering up is this equality with God. And he starts to say, well, is that really going to be the best for you, Eve? Maybe you'll get a little bit more satisfaction, a little bit more status if you go this way with it. And to me, this speaks to, again, what I keep saying, we have to understand whose story that we're in. And whenever we start to think of our own selfish gain, our own, how are we going to benefit from this, we begin to miss the mark, and we begin to miss the point of whose story that we are in. So after Adam and Eve, they take this fruit, I want to draw attention to the fact that their first reaction is to cover up and to hide. And I want to make a point about this that ties in what we talked about before. So much of our lives are these fig leaves. They're these kind of concepts, these things that we do in life to cover up and to hide our own guilt or our own insecurity. And so, man, I see memes about this all the time. It's like, you have one bad social interaction and like you just crumble because you're awkward. And so there's so many different ways that this can play out in our lives, whether it's, literally like our image of our body, projecting confidence, trying to achieve in school or in other facets of life, maybe what we have as far as material possessions, maybe surrounding ourselves with friends to kind of hide. All of these things work together sometimes as fig leaves to hide the fact that we are insecure about something, that we feel guilty about something, that we are just trying to cover it up, that we do not feel like we can stand before God or maybe even stand before other people completely bare. And so I don't want you to miss the fact that before this, Adam and Eve were naked, and that seems silly to us, almost like, you get the cartoon picture drawings of this story, and it's like you chuckle at it because it seems so foreign and off. But there's something beautiful about the fact that these people, before sin entered the world, before they made that choice, were able to stand before one another and stand before God completely unashamed and not having to secure their own view to their own. Other people's view is not dependent on what they were wearing, what they were doing. That's really what these fig leaves represent. And so after they make this choice and try to cover up and hide and run, I think it's amazing, and I don't want you to miss the point that God says, where are you? That if the first creation story last week was about this majestic God that creates the cosmos and the world, and he brings it out of nothing and he creates order, that this God is a God that does not stand far off, that he is walking in the garden, he's talking with people, and he comes and looks for us, and he says, where are you? And there's so much that we could say there about, this quick exchange about like, who told you that you were naked? But what I want you to see is that God is seeking for this relationship, that his statements here indicate, and this is a key point, that there is a disconnect between him and humans at this point. And he's saying, why are you running? Look at yourself, you're running. And so, seat in the full upright and locked position, like the result of our actions, of our sin, to choose a different way other than what God says, changes everything. The sin of the original couple changes everything. And this is a total worldview shaper. And so we're going to look like, in this story, look like there's the serpent's curse, the woman's curse, and then the man's curse. And what are we to do with this? Like, God says to the serpent, you're gonna lose his legs and he's gonna eat some dust. What is he talking about there? And to the woman, there's going to be childbearing pain, and your desire is going to be for your husband, but he'll rule over her. And then to the man, the land has changed. Thorns and thistles burst forth, and he's going to work really hard, and it's going to be a really tough life for him. He's going to struggle, and then eventually he's going to die. And so this next section, I want to talk about, what are we to make of all this? What are we to make of really what happened and the implications of what happened? So what are we to make of all of this? What went wrong? So I just want to acknowledge the fact that, universally, as human beings, we all have this gut feeling that things aren't as they should be, that something went wrong, that we live in the midst of this world gone wrong. And maybe this is just the way that things are. This is just the cards that we were dealt by, a great accident. But I want you guys to know that the rejection of God had major effects on everything that we see around us and even within us. And so if we're going to talk about really this idea of sin, I want to shape just quickly our view of what that is. So we may talk more about this in the coming weeks, but sin, the way that I want you to understand it right now for this current lesson is that sin is a diagnosis of human nature. And what I mean by that is it's the fact that we miss the mark. Sin is missing the mark. It is missing the goal. So that's a different way of thinking about sin than just transgressions like white and black. We did something really wrong, something evil maybe even. But in this story, it's missing the mark. And what I mean by that is that whenever we choose to live in a way that's different than our original design, our original calling, our original commission to go out to bear God's image, to bear God's goodness as His representatives, to take care of the earth, to tend the earth, and so many different ways to reflect the goodness of God and to really be these priests in God's creation, in God's garden that should cover the whole earth. Whenever we sin, it is missing that mark. And so these curses that you see on the serpent, the woman, and man really reflect that we have missed the mark, and that sin has now stained everything. And it's not just this one-dimensional thing where sin is just wrong and now we have to go to hell because Eve ate this apple. But sin infects every part of our human experience. And so as I was talking with Sarah and Dylan about this lesson, there's some things that I want to just kind of quickly illustrate how sin has affected our lives that may be more relevant. So like the porn industry, how is that sin if we kind of run it through this worldview? Well, man, like human beings are not meant to just be these sexual objects for viewing of other people's pleasure, and then that is that man or woman's sole purpose. And that is missing the mark of why that human being exists. The person who's making that, and then also the person that's viewing that is taking this beautiful relationships that could be between two human beings in the context of marriage, for this greater purpose of bearing God's image to the world, of bringing His goodness to every situation that they are in. And that is to miss the mark completely through just that situation of porn. It's more than just porn is bad and like you shouldn't do it. It's missing the mark of the creation of human beings. The obesity epidemic, the fact that God gives us our bodies to tend the earth, to display His goodness, is to just say that my body and my soul, like those are two different things, and really this body is just getting me there. Like, man, that is to miss the mark, and to just treat your body as a part of creation, that it does not reflect God's goodness as a gift. That is missing the mark. We see this through politics, when human beings that have missed the mark get together in parties and they vie for their own positions in society instead of displaying God's goodness. Those people get together and they try to influence laws and whole countries. They are missing the mark that is not their story, but it is God's story that they're in. And you can see like how all of these things like that we view as sinful, you may still view them that way, but sin has stained all of these different aspects of our human life because it's simply missing the mark that God has set before us. And so I wrote down like our conscience, callings, art, ethics, family, marriage, health, history, imagination, culture, society, work, ecology, our free time, our rest, worship, our sexuality, and even, this is a big one for me, communication, were all stained by sin of the original couple. And we are dealing with that fallout. Sin even affects the earth. We see that in man's curse. Like, in the way that things should be is that the garden really offered up its fruit, and we got to enjoy the goodness of God through the goodness of creation. But we see that there's all these natural disasters, and life is hard, and there's disease and all of those things. It's because sin has stained our whole existence. And this sin even permeates human society and human history. And we're going to see that throughout even this story of God working with people, of revealing himself to people. We are going to see how sin has stained all of this. And sin has kind of welled up even in these corrupt societies. Man, all of this works together. And most importantly, sin separates us from God. The fact that he is holy and just, like, he cannot be in the presence of sinful beings. And so we're cast out from the garden. So if that's not a downer, what's the solution? Universally, there's a belief that there's hope to make this world a better place. That things should not be the way that they are. Religion and philosophy, politics, activists, revolutionaries, reformers, all of these people, they all have an idea on how to make the world right. There's so many different prescriptions out there on ways that we should do this. And it's like, is there hope? Is there anything that we can do is really the big question. And I want to just say, because this is so near to my heart, this was such a revolutionary point in my faith and my understanding, is the question is not so short-sighted and so simple, unimaginative, and really just boring. The question is not how can we get to heaven. And that is such a short-sighted view of our existence as human beings. The question is, how can man and God dwell together again in the good creation? And how can we get things to the way that they were in the garden? That man and God were together and things were as they should be. Relationship with one another as humans were as they should be. The earth was as it should be, and our relationship with God was as it should be. And the biggest part of that is God's presence, that God was with us. And I think all of this is pointing towards Emmanuel. So why did we want to study the Old Testament this year is it gives so much significance to the things that you have heard all of your life. And so you may have heard that Jesus is called Emmanuel, and you have absolutely no idea why that's significant, why that should be cool, or even why he has another name. Matthew talks about Emmanuel, which is really an allusion back to Isaiah, when it talks about a child will be born and he will be called God with us. And I hope you're getting goosebumps, that the hairs on your arm are raising up, is because Jesus is this fulfillment of God being with us again. That God is again walking among his people, and we get the joy of experiencing perfect relationship with him, and then we are put back into a right relationship as his followers with other human beings and God himself. And it's not necessarily that we are trying to go back and be the Garden of Eden, but we are recreating with Jesus the Garden of Eden all across the earth. So one of the amazing things that really struck me the first times that I was studying through the Gospels as a college student was why does Jesus do these healings? What does that have to do with anything? It's the point that God, Jesus, God in the flesh, is God with us, but wherever he goes, literally, he is bearing God's image and goodness to the creation, like to wherever he is at. He is fully embodying this principle of bearing God's image and being a priest in God's temple. And so literally, where Jesus is like the Garden of Eden. Things are as they should be. And I want you to fully embrace, as Jesus' followers, that is the mission and vision that God is calling you into. That he is calling you to walk with Emmanuel. Just like Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden, to walk with Jesus is to walk with God. And things are as they should be when you are in a relationship with him. So when we look at this story, I kept thinking of this, like, you don't be the person that looks at a group photo and immediately you only look at yourself to determine whether this is a good picture or not. So what I'm meaning by that is, don't look at this story, and if you're a woman, look immediately at the curse for women, or if you're a man, look at the curse for men, or if you're a serpent, no, I'm kidding. Don't look at this story and look only to the parts that you think like apply directly to you, and then make your assumption on what this story is about. I want you guys to look at these first two stories, and specifically this one today, and I want you to see the image of God that is being painted here, the image of God that is being communicated here. And people talk about the scandal of the cross. Man, look at the scandal of God clothing Adam and Eve. You have this majestic God that creates the cosmos. You have this God that breathes life into Adam and Eve. And he has given them everything, quite literally. And then one of their first acts is to betray him, is to go against his commands. And he doesn't wipe them from existence. He makes them clothes. He clothes them, and that really has this to do with this concept of dignity. He gives them their dignity back, and the consequences of their sin still stand, but he still clothes them, and there's scandal in that. Why does this God, like, that would have been shocking to people in the ancient Near East, and it should be shocking to us. And what did these people do to deserve such forgiveness, such goodness? And the answer is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And so I want us to end on the fact that if you're reading verse 15, you're probably asking, like, why does the Bible, not end here? It's because God is going to do something with Eve's seed, with Eve's offspring. This is, what people have talked about, with the serpent. It says, like, he will strike his heel, but the man will crush his head. That's something that's referred to as the proto-evangelion, which is a fancy way of saying the pre-gospel. It's the good news, and it's this allusion to maybe Jesus was right here in this text even from the beginning, that in the end, like, this serpent as representative of dust for death and manipulation and corruption and really sin and badness, that it's going to strike the heel of humanity, but in the end, maybe Eve's offspring is going to crush the head of evil and darkness and death. And again, if your hairs aren't standing up on your arm, like, I don't know what to do for you, but this is an amazing lesson, and I want y'all to see this God that's revealing himself to human beings. Like, what is this God like? And please reread this text and just examine, what is this story trying to say about who this God is. All right, I love you guys, and I look forward to seeing y'all next week.